So we're going to talk about AB 506, and not surprisingly, this is going to be a continuation of a conversation that Church and Casualty has already kicked off in a webinar that we did back at the beginning of the year when AB 506 was relatively new and we were trying to navigate and figure out what it meant and how to comply with it. So this is not meant to be a repeat of those things. If this is the first time you've ever heard of AB 506, which I doubt, if you needed that information, the white paper discussion and analysis, the video presentation that we did that captures all those basic first impression, first times trying to understand this legislation and actual put your hands on the various pieces of legislation that are referenced in AB 506 and other frequently asked questions, you can go to ministrysafe.com/AB 506. Or you can go to the CCIA's website, and it might be that myccia.com/AB 506, but I'll let the folks at CCIA direct you to where those resources are going to appear on their webpage. Now, just to kind of give us a ramp up on what we need to discuss today, we've got new standards of care. Now, interestingly, what standard of care means in the legal world is this is what you have to do about a foreseeable risk, okay? Reasonable steps to be able to address a foreseeable risk. Child sexual abuse in ministry is a foreseeable risk. So not surprisingly, AB 506 is going to speak into what we should be doing. But I just don't want us to see AB 506 as the first time anybody has introduced any expectation into what we need to do to protect children. In fact, way before AB 506, there was already a standard of care that required you to address training, policies and procedures, criminal background checks, and things on top of that, applications, reference checks, interview, forms of screening. Okay, so AB 506, it speaks into a section of what already is our standard of care. So please don't think, as long as I've checked all the AB 506 boxes, I'm good to go, because that's not a correct understanding of our obligations. We just simply need to understand some of them we were navigating and using our judgment. Now AB 506 takes some of that judgment away from us and makes some requirements that we need to modify and account for. And I'm going to walk you through not the basic here's what it means, but some of the questions that are continuing to flow from this. In other words, I'd say 90% of the organizations in California will begrudge the fact that it was a not well-crafted piece of legislation, but we've figured out how to apply those requirements and move forward. But there's a handful of organizations that are either not asking the right questions, or they're coming at it from a standpoint that we don't want to comply with it. Therefore, we're going to read it very narrowly and closely to create an understanding where it's not going to apply to me. Okay, and those are just not healthy conversations to have. So if you're one of those people, you're probably not on this webinar, but it's probably not a healthy conversation anyway, because I don't want to try to convince you this is legislation that's talking to all youth service organizations in California, all right? But it's also challenging to know, see, this legislation's hard enough to understand all by itself. But then I've started to learn from organizations that are they're over here in a ditch somewhere. It's like, wait, why are you over there? Well, I received some instruction from my HR, software people. I got some instruction from another voice. I got another instruction from this group over here. And there's a lot of voices out there trying to speak into AB 506. And giving some very interesting, creative, and not correct advice. So I want to try to identify what are the top 6 or 7 things that are still remaining out there that either we need to overcome somebody's poor instruction into the marketplace, or just to continue to tackle things that the California legislature didn't think through before they ready, fire, aimed us. So with that being said, the legislation analysis that we started with was who is impacted by this new law? What action is required? How do I comply? Here are the questions that still stay within this flow. And instead of going to the who, what, and how, I'm going to go into the requirements of the training, background check, policies. And so here are some of the things people are still struggling with. Let's start with the training. All right, so this would have been that section A in the new legislation. So some of the questions sound like this. Well, what trainings do I use? Okay, it references that particular California mandated reporter training. It's long. It doesn't integrate with any way in which I can give information to my people and track and refresh that. What are the other options available? Is there any oversight entity or agency that can tell me what is approved, what is my pathway? Or is there anybody that if I'm doing it wrong, it's going to show up with a clipboard and tell me that I have to do push-ups, or I'm going to need to be fined, or there's some penalty or difficulty for me not doing this exactly right? Okay, so additionally, there's questions that arise related to, well, help me understand this volunteers versus regular volunteers and what application that's going to create in terms of difficulties I need to overcome. And then there's questions about, what about administrator employees that don't have any relationship to children? Do they still need to comply with these elements? And then finally, how often should I renew this training? All right, so let's just jump into these first two. All right, so it's kind of that question of, all right, the law told me that this is a training I can use. Is that the training I must use? Let's go ahead and just look into the law, okay? So in AB 506, this is your section 18975, paragraph A. So just so you know, it's not like I switched gears from, it's like, wait a minute, I thought we were talking about AB 506. Well, AB means assembly bill, okay? So that's the delivery system for these new code sections. So the code section that deals with training under AB 506 is this paragraph A, and it gives us this instruction. An administrator, employee, or regular volunteer. We're going to need to talk about what does it mean, regular volunteer, in our compliance and application, but of a youth service organization. Now, I'm not having many people struggle with that anymore. It's like, when in doubt, if you have kids in your programming, you're a youth service organization. These people shall complete a training on child abuse, neglect identification, and reporting. And then it tells us, here's your requirements. You must do this child abuse training. You may use this particular training to be able to satisfy that obligation. All right, and it gives the identification of that State Department of Social Services training. It's about a 4-hour-long training that's usually required by mandated reporters to complete. So it's saying, new requirement of training. Here's who has to complete it. We're not telling you which training to use, but here is option number 1. All right, that's as far as the law goes. I've heard some people telling me, well, I called somebody in the California system and they told me there's a 2-hour version of this training for non-mandated reporters, and they're giving me instructions that I could do this or I could do that. It's like, all of that's helpful. All of that puts tools on the table for you to choose to use, but I want to make sure it's clear that AB 506 doesn't say that. AB 506 says you shall do a child abuse training that involves identification and reporting, and here's your option 1. So part of our analysis in this is, okay, what is it about this particular training that the legislature wants your people to have as instruction? And it walks through not just child sexual abuse, because remember, it's a child abuse and neglect. That's broader than child sexual abuse. So your training first and fundamentally needs to be a deep dive into child sexual abuse, the grooming process of the preferential offender, peer-to-peer sexual abuse, but it must also include other forms of child abuse, and those are clearly outlined in this training: physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and other forms of maltreatment. And then there needs to be specific content in that training that talks about the California reporting requirements and the California reporting processes. Okay? So from our standpoint, you may use this training, but there's not a requirement that you use this training. Okay? So what is available, if you would call somebody in just the Department of Social Services, well, here's your 4-hour training, and then there's another 2-hour version of it. There are options for you to consider. Now, you still bump into the challenges of, I don't have a delivery system. I'm essentially sending all of my people to a website to take a training that they have to register for and then go through the administrative process of bringing me back certificates of completion to confirm that I'm in compliance. Okay, so just one of the ways that we've tried to solve this problem is helping people understand your training needs to not be limited to just sexual abuse. You've got to have these other requirements. Frankly, I want your training to include much more than what I have seen communicated clearly in those trainings I referenced, especially as it relates to grooming and peer-to-peer. So we can help you do that by this main ministry safe training plus the supplements that get you to compliance with AB 506. Now, are there other compliant trainings out there? It's like, I know several industries that are trying to do exactly what we've done in creating trainings that are specific for their particular type of industry or their particular type of programming. So you're going to see more options and opportunities come online. Now, it's still going to be a how do you create the administrative ability to train, track, and refresh. But for those voices that are saying there's only one avenue to be able to satisfy this requirement, or there's only two and these are those, it's like there's lots of opportunities to be able to comply with this. The first and foremost one is that California specific 4-hour training. And then there are others. We're simply one of those options. So I just wanted you to know, whatever that voice is that's telling you these are your only options, the law has made it clear that you can use this training, but it's not a requirement. All right, now let's stay within the training questions, because a lot of the questions are now, which one of my volunteers need to complete this? Or which one of my volunteers have to comply with any portion of AB 506? Now, here's where we need to get into the law and understand what is a regular volunteer, because this is tricky, all right? Here's what we understand from the law in terms of training. Now, this is going to be the same analysis for the training and the background checks, but it says that an administrator, employee, or, and then they give us a specific term. It's like, now wait, what does that mean? Well, then they provide us that further definition, and it's a volunteer that has direct contact or supervision of children and works at 16 hours a month or 32 hours a year. Okay, see, they're trying to create this carve out that recognizes, you know what, there's some volunteers that all that person's going to do is paint faces for 4 days of summer during BBS. That's somebody that's outside this list of regular volunteers. What we're really trying to capture is those people that have some predictable and repeatable, consistent time with young people, because they're the ones that we want to group into this requirement. All right. Now I want to caution you here. I've got plenty of ministries especially that are calling me saying, hey, we have an idea. What we're going to do is we're going to start staggering our volunteers so that nobody's working any more than 32 hours a year. And then we're going to do this program where we shift out of direct supervision so they're not a regular volunteer for the sake of this ministry at all times. Like, I would tell you generally, stop it. This is not the place to play. The goal should not be to do what we can to find ways to carve ourselves away from this particular requirement. Our goal should be that we want to protect children. So in terms of training, I'm a huge advocate for training. I would tell you to train everyone. In fact, here in a moment, I'm going to tell you to train everyone. So this trying to do this splitting of hairs to try to carve your people out of the requirement is not good form. Not a best practice, and it's not the way in which you try to discharge your responsibility to protect children. So for those entities that truly have that person that all they do is transport a child 2 or 3 times a year for an hour, those people that are not regular volunteers generally are pretty easy to identify who they are, and they have a very low impact and minimal role in our ministries. But for those people that, when in doubt, just consider them a regular volunteer. All right, so that's just not the place to play the game. But for those people who are not regular volunteers, they are not required to complete the training, and they are not required to comply with that background check provision, which I'm about to mention in a moment. So in terms of best practices, so even though they've given us a safe harbor or this carve out for a particular group of people, the best practice is not to try to manipulate our way into where we don't have to comply with it. Best practice is, frankly, it's just the opposite. Across the board, if anybody wears my name tag for any length of time, whether they're working with children or not, I would request they complete the training. All right? So don't play the game. In addition, there's nothing in the law that says how often should we refresh this training. Okay? And I would just recommend to you every 2 years. Now, AB 506 kicked off in January of 2022. We haven't gotten to that point where anybody needs to refresh that yet. But if you wanted to make that a yearly refreshing, I'm certainly not going to fight you. But if you're one of those people that says, well, AB 506 said there's no requirement that I have to repeat the training, so I'm never going to, that's not best form either. So the best practice here is just refresh that every 2 years. Now, in terms of abuse training, we just need to understand that there are training options. There is no oversight entity, and the which volunteers is going to be all volunteers in my view, but in terms of what AB 506, you're regular volunteers. Now, the question then arises, what about administrators and employees that don't have any role that relates to children? Say you've got an enormous nonprofit that serves children, but you have somebody that's up here as the CEO or someone who's the chief financial officer. It's like that person never gets down and has any interactivity with children. Is there a way in which that person can be exempt from this training requirement? And the answer is no. Okay? And I don't want to argue as to whether or not I think that's a good idea or not. I'm just here to straight up tell you whether I think it's a good idea or not. It says an administrator or employee shall complete training. The only place where we get this carve out as to these volunteers have to do it. These particular volunteers, if you meet these criteria, do not. There is no such carve out or harbor for the administrators and the employees. So the way you read this is, it doesn't matter if you're a direct line in involvement with child or not. If you are an employee or an administrator of an organization, which is a youth service organization, you shall complete this training. All right, so it's everybody. Now I want to just try to help you understand, there's been some people that have tried to play this game with their administrators and employees, and that's not available to you. All right, so don't play the game. Don't do the mathematics available to regular volunteers and apply that to administrators and employees. They are required under the law to do that. So no safe harbors for those administrators and employees. All administrators and employees regardless of their role. Now, there's going to be some more I want to say about this in a moment, but I want to wait till I get to the background check piece, because that's when another question related to administrators and employees is going to come about. So let's get there and talk about kind of landing the plane, refresh that every 2 years. Now, let's go to background checks. Now, the question that we had to address at the beginning of this analysis, way back in January, was, okay, well, I'm already doing criminal background checks. Do I need to stop doing this background check and now start doing what's required by AB 506? And what in the world is required by AB 506? It's very difficult to navigate this. Okay? I want to start with just the general standard of care that exists, even before AB 506, that AB 506 did not make go away. Standard of care is that every child serving organization must make a reasonable effort to obtain information about a staff member or volunteer's past criminal history. So that thing that you are doing to try to gather that information, what AB 506 has done is required you to do a background check that sadly is going to really only drill down into one subset of information. So in my opinion, what I'm going to lay out for you here is this background check required by AB 506 does not alone satisfy your standard of care to make that reasonable effort to obtain information. Because all the AB 506 background check is going to give you is only California Department of Justice information. It's going to be there's no information in the California Department of Justice related to other states or the sex offender registry. So AB 506 is very narrow in terms of its requirement that gets you records. There is still your obligation as a standard of care to make a reasonable search for information that must go beyond what's required by AB 506. All right, so let's walk through this. It's 18975B. So earlier we looked at 18975A on the training. B is the background check. And it tells us, again, administrator, employer, regular volunteer of a youth service organization shall undergo a background check, and you must use this. Understand the difference in the language from the training. On the training piece, it says you shall do the training and you may use this one to satisfy it. The background check paragraph does not say that. It says you shall do the background check, and it shall be this particular one. Okay, and it talks about this section 1105.3 search. So in the prior webinar, we're not going back there to walk you through what is a 1105.3 search. We all know by now, at least you should, that it's a live scan search that requires the fingerprinting. We know there's an FBI add-on. Okay, so most of my people are familiar by now of what is the 1105.3 search. And since this is not where we're going to talk about that, if you need to go back and get some of that prior material, it lays it all out for you there. Now, at the beginning, when people would start to understand, wow, this 1105.3 search is going to require me to go get an ORI number, set up my account, have that particular dedicated and protected email as a way in which to receive information. Now, there was that you couldn't comply in January and February because when people would make application for their ORI numbers, it was like a several months backlog. Now, we even applied for an ORI number to be able to learn how that's done and try to make it to where we can accommodate that system using some code that we can integrate into the Ministry Safe system, and we're still doing that. But nonetheless, it took us, having requested our code in December of 2021, it took us till like May to get our ORI number. So most of the organizations between January and May weren't even able to begin to comply with this because of the difficulty and the backlog of overwhelming the California system of people now having to get that set up. By now, most of the organizations that I've talked to have received their ORI number. They're figuring out that dedicated and protected email system to be able to receive information, and they're starting to move forward here. So it's not generally the questions related to what does it mean and what do I do? Now there are some lingering questions on, wait a minute, to whom does it apply? Who is subject to this search? And how often do I have to refresh this search? And what if somebody has done the live scan background check with the school where they're a teacher, or in this after school program, can I just use the benefit of their search and have that person print it and bring it to me? And is this the substitute for what I was doing? In other words, should I stop what I was doing and simply do the live scan? Those are the four main questions that we're helping people navigate. So let's start with the first one. Who's subject to this particular search? And the answer is, again, administrators, employees, and regular volunteers. Now, with the regular volunteers, this is where most of the people are doing their work to carve people out of this, simply because this new live scan search is expensive and it's not easy administratively. And if you could carve out, say, half of your volunteer staff, you can save money and save trouble and not create more difficulty in trying to get and maintain your volunteers. All right, so same analysis applies from our training piece that I would tell you, don't play games here in trying to manipulate people out of that definition. We just need to understand these are the people that wear our name tag to help us accomplish the missions that we're trying to deliver in this program. All right. But as it relates to the background check, most of the questions that I'm getting again are about the administrators' employees. So that you may have this large organization where, say, it's a church with 200 staff members and volunteers, and only 40 of those people have any interaction with children. But you're telling me I've got to do 160 background check and live scan type of background checks for these people who have no interaction with children. I would tell you that's exactly what the law says. Okay, there's no carve out for, employees that don't deal with children or administrators that don't do, so many hours a year, in their role in administration or on a board or something like that. Okay, so it's a sweeping legislation, and it requires this particular response. Now, I've had some organizations that try to get creative. Say, for example, it's a nonprofit or it's a ministry that has a children's after-school program, but it also has a shelter, and it has this, help the homeless store and things like that, that they're trying to think through their corporate structure changes. So, like, maybe we'll just take all of our program that involves children and reincorporate that or redesignate that so it becomes a freestanding thing, and that becomes the youth service organization. And everything over here is something different that keeps us out of having to do these training requirements and the criminal background checks, which are so expensive and difficult. Now, the couple of conversations I've had with organizations like that were very, very tricky. So I'm telling you, maybe you're one of those people that analysis would be useful and valuable. Get good legal counsel to do that, okay? Don't try to just put a DBA or something over here to try to carve out a group of people and do it poorly. So if you truly want to reorganize and create structure that really identifies clearly who is your YSO, your youth service organization, do that very, very carefully. Now, in terms of the question of how often should I refresh this live scan search, I would tell you, you don't. And the reason why I say that is that one of the features of that 1105.3 search, which is a benefit, is what's called a continuous monitoring. So that's an evergreen search. When you actually have somebody roll their fingerprints and you submit that, upload that form through the live scan system, it's going to return to you a report. But if that person ever does get a record that hits the California Department of Justice, there will be a new report that's provided to you to always keep you up to date on that criminal activity with that person with that particular fingerprint match. All right, so it's called continuous monitoring. Now, that's a feature that we're providing to our clients in the background check world just across the board, okay? But the California DOJ search, that 1105.3 search, that is one of the features of that search, which means you don't refresh it. It's automatically refreshing itself in the event that person is arrested for a fingerprinted offense. It matches something in the California DOJ, and then that report is sent to that particular ORI number user. Okay, so if you have more questions about that, you contact my office and I'll help you better understand that. But the short answer to this question is you don't need to refresh the 1105.3 search like you've possibly been refreshing some of these private vendor searches up until this point. Okay, now let's talk about those other searches, those are the private vendor searches. I would tell you that if you are already doing something before, there is need to continue to do something other than the 1105.3 search. And in our first webinar, we used Larry Nasser as the example. Okay, Larry Nasser was arrested in 2015 in the state of Michigan related to child porn and sexual abuse charges. He pled guilty to federal charges related to child pornography and distribution of child pornography, and he's in prison. Now, there's been some other legal drama associated with his bad behavior since then, but nonetheless, criminally convicted in 2015. All right. Let's say that magically Larry Nasser is paroled, or in one way or another, he is released from prison and he decides to come and work with a youth service organization in California. If you did the 1105.3 search, it will not give you Michigan records, no matter how notorious those records are. It will not give you the sex offender registry. All right, so you are still in your standard of care required to make a reasonable search of available criminal information regarding your applicant. But see, the 11053 search is a very narrow subset of information that accesses. So maybe you were doing a nationwide search plus a number of different counties in California. Well, you may not need to do the number of different counties in California anymore, but there still needs to be the performance of some basic search that reaches outside the state of California and make sure that it hits the sex offender registries. All right, so it may mean a modification to what you were doing to bring it down to where it's catching the things that the 1105.3 search cannot. You just need to make a good strategy of balancing the resources while also complying with AB506. So we comply with the law, but we still satisfy the standard of care with respect to the background check is broader than that's provided by AB506. Okay, so let's switch to policies and procedures. And this is where I think we have the most value to add, because here's where we're getting most of the questions associated with how do I comply with this? All right, and the policies and procedures is going to connect to the 2-adult rule and your volunteers. All right, so again, let's start with just general standard of care on policies and procedures. Because again, here's your standard of care. AB506 discusses this. So where it could have been talking about a waterfront of things that need to be addressed in your policies and procedures, AB506 gets very narrowly focused in a particular aspect of your policies and procedures. So your general standard of care is this. You have to have policies and procedures that provide a written framework describing what is and is not permissible within the program related to sexual abuse risk. All right, that is considered reasonable. Now, AB 506 is going to speak to one element of those policies and procedures because the broader sense, policy should be covering far more than a two-adult rule. It should be rooted in the grooming process. It should dovetail with your training on the grooming process and peer-to-peer sexual abuse, trusted time alone, traveling with young people, hotel use, staffing ratios with children, electronic communication and social media, communicating reporting processes internally and how that's done externally. So there's a number of other things your policies need to deal with, but AB 506 drills into a particular aspect, actually two particular aspects, but they're both related. Let me show you what I mean by that. Here's paragraph C. So we looked at 18975A on training, B on background checks, now C on the policies and procedures. So here we go. A youth service organization shall develop and implement child abuse prevention policies and procedures, including, again, but not limited to, both of these two things. Here are the two things. One, let's actually go to number 2 first because that's the order it makes most sense. The first thing you need to do is make sure that you, to the greatest extent possible, have 2 mandated reporters present when you're gathering children. And you make sure that your policies ensure that there's a requirement that information related to incidents of abuse be communicated outside the organization. All right. This is generally not the tricky part, the reporting outside the organization, but it's going to be important for us to understand what is the legislature getting at. Here's where most of the questions come from is how do I interpret this at least 2 mandated reporters? So there's been a number of ways I've had people, ask me this question and tell me, and here's what I think I'm going to do as I interpret this. So in addition to having already had policies in place, one entity told me, it's like, well, here's how our lawyer told us how to understand this. We're a medium-sized church, so we have a number of different toddlers, children's ministry, middle school, high school ministry, and we're supposed to have 2 mandated reporters. Okay, so as long as I've got 2 mandated reporters in my facility at any given time, I will have satisfied this requirement. Okay? This is the 2-adult rule, but the way that entity is interpreting this is that as long as I have 2 mandated reporters, let's say I've got a couple of nurses, yep, they're mandated reporters, as long as I have them in our building during children's programming, I will have satisfied policies requiring the presence of 2 mandated reporters. I don't think that's what the legislature is getting at. Okay, the legislature, keep in mind, is evaluating this sexual abuse crisis suffered by the Boy Scouts of America. And just the horror about, whoa, we want to pass legislation in such a way that this crisis, 88,000 sexual abuse victims and a $3 billion settlement fund, that's not going to happen again, at least not with the children in California. And so we got AB 506, A, B, C, with C being making sure that we have policies in place to ensure there's always 2 adults where we're gathering children. What's the point of that? It's consistent with what is already standard of care long before AB 506 came around. In fact, AB 506 is trying to codify it, just didn't do it very well. It's the idea that if you have a children's ministry and you have a gathering of a bunch of 5- and 6-year-olds, you need to have 2 adults in that room. If you've got middle school ministry, depending on how many kids you have, you need at least 2 adults in that room. So what AB 506, in looking at this crisis with Boy Scouts, concluding that clearly there weren't 2 adults around and this person was able to create an unobserved one-on-one situation, which is what led to the abuse, we're going to make the requirement that there be at least 2 adults where you're providing program for children. So not one particular unsupervised adult can have unsupervised access unto bad behavior. Okay, so this is not satisfied, in my opinion, and in my reading of the law, by simply just having 2 people who happen to be on the list of mandated reporters in your building while you're having programming related to children. This is a true 2-adult rule. Now, many of my ministries, we were already struggling with 2-adult rules. Okay, and even adding that second component of 2 unrelated adult rule. Okay, so the challenge of having 2 adults is not new. We're always needing volunteers, and COVID didn't help us in that challenge. But nonetheless, even before AB506, I would tell you that's a critically important part of your policies and procedures to ensure that we have 2 adults. But see, the trick that AB506 has given us is not just 2 adults. See, it doesn't say 2 adults. It says 2 mandated reporters. Okay, now let's go back to what questions are arising from this. Some of my folks say, well, wait a minute. My staffing, I've got 2 people, but one of those people that's helping me lead this class is a 17-year-old girl that's helping me lead the first grade class. Like, no, that 17-year-old girl does not count as one of your 2 mandated reporters. Because remember, back before, your regular volunteer has to be someone at least 18 years old. Okay? So teenagers don't count as one of your 2 adults. But even before AB 506, teenagers don't count in your staffing ratio because you see, if you're using a 15-year-old to help you lead music in a first grade class, that 16-year-old, that 15-year-old is still in need of making sure that we discharge our responsibility to protect that person because that person is a minor. All right, so general rule, teens don't count as part of your staffing ratio or your 2 adults, much less your 2 mandated reporters. Okay, so here's where the real trick lies in terms of some of the questions that are being asked. Am I supposed to replace all of my volunteers that lead my ministries with people that are mandated reporters? Okay, am I supposed to take Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Clark, who are lovely and they've been teaching this particular 5th grade class for years? Do I have to tell them, thank you, I can't use you anymore, or go find 2 additional people that are mandated reporters on that list and make sure that they're in the room with them as well? Because if that's the case, how do I possibly do that? Okay. Again, I think this is where we've got poorly drafted law, but let me give you some analysis and then help you understand how I'm advising people on how to comply with this, okay? So let's just take my 2 people. I got Jane and I got Barb. All right, Jane, she's a California mandated reporter. So if you pulled up that penal code section and you saw a number of different professions listed on there, those people will all have been considered mandated reporters by profession by the state of California. Unequivocal and clear. So we could make Jane a teacher, a cop, a nurse, some type of a social worker or counselor where she will have been on that mandated reporter list. Now Barb is not on the list. Okay? Barb is just somebody who's, going through life, whether she works somewhere, whatever, but she does not have a profession or licensure that places her on the California mandated reporter list. All right, so what's the difference between Jane and Barb before AB 506? Okay, well, AB 506, here's the question for us. Does AB 506 make Barb a mandated reporter? Okay, and the answer to that question, in my opinion, is no and yes, right? Spoken like a typical lawyer, all right? No and yes. Here's what I mean by no. Technically, no. The law does not create a new category of mandated reporter that puts Barb up there, all right? But yes, functionally. So no technically, but yes functionally. What do I mean by that? All right, pre-AB 506, here's Jane. Jane's a professional, she's licensed, okay? Which means she will have received training. And the training may have been that DSS training on, the 4-hour training on child abuse, California reporting requirements and the California reporting processes. Okay? As a mandated reporter by law under that penal code section, Jane is required to report abuse and neglect to an outside organization, to the authorities. All right? So before AB 506, what's the difference between Jane and Barb, aside from just the profession that Jane happens to be in? And the difference is Jane has received training, And Jane is required by the penal code to report that outside the organization. Now we have AB 506. So what's the impact of AB 506? Well, Barb is now functionally the equivalent of Jane. Because Barb, if she's a regular volunteer or an employee or an administrator of any youth service organization, she's required to receive a training under 18975A. And that training must be the same or the equivalent of the training that Jane gets with respect to sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, California reporting processes, and the California reporting requirements. All right? So now Jane and Barb are the same in terms of the training they get, but because of this new 18975C1 that now requires youth service organizations to have all of their administrators, employees, and regular volunteers have a requirement to report abuse outside the organization, now Barb is functionally the equivalent of Jane. Because now Barb, like Jane, has received training required by law and is required to report outside the organization as required by law. So Barb doesn't magically wind up on the list of mandated reporters, but I hope you can see that what the legislature accomplished was the same thing. Barb is now functionally a mandated reporter because she's received the same instruction and training that Jane and every other mandated reporter has received. So now when I go back to the legislation and I'm trying to satisfy my obligations under this particular paragraph C, now I've got Barb who's received training, and now Barb is required to comply with policies and procedures under AB 506 that say this: the organization must have at least 2 mandated reporters, and the policies ensure for the reporting of the suspected incidents outside the organization. So long as the organization has put this piece in place requiring that of Barb, then Barb is functionally a mandated reporter. Okay, do you hear me? Functionally. Which means that doesn't make her a mandated reporter as somebody that appears on that list, but in my opinion, that's what the law was set out to accomplish, was to make sure that everybody working with children, all the children in California, are going to be in programs where there's at least 2 people in that program who have been trained to recognize bad behavior and instructed to report that bad behavior, and the training provided them with the information necessary to know what those requirements are and what are those specific California processes. So what I'm trying to help my people understand, as long as Barb is trained and you have this policy and procedure in place that it's reported outside, then Barb can satisfy your requirement as a mandated reporter in that particular group. So that's use of logic to understand in poorly drafted legislation, how do I accomplish what the legislature wants from me? And I think that can get you to a place that you need to be. So here's the bumpers on that bowling alley, if you will. So long as Barb has training, she's had her background check done under that 1105.3, and the organization implements the policies required report to the outside of the organization, functionally, she can serve as one of your 2 adults. This logic does not work if you've backed Barb out of being a regular volunteer. In other words, you can't say, well, Barb is just a volunteer that works less than 16 hours a month, or Barb doesn't do more than 32 hours a year, which means Barb doesn't need to get the training or the criminal background check. Then using Barb as one of your mandated reporters fails. I hope that made sense. So in summary, the best practice, even before AB 506, is to train all of your volunteers, regardless of how many hours they work. Train all of your executives, train all of your administrators and your employees. Do the background check for everybody, not just the 1105.3, but the broader, to make sure you're not missing anything else in the country. Make sure your policies and procedures have a number of things covered, including the piece that says we are going to report to the outside organizations. And then Barb and Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Clark can continue to serve in their role because you've equipped them in such a way that they are a functional mandated reporter in the state of California. So best practices, Everyone is trained. That way you're not going back and trying to determine, wait a minute, was Barb a regular volunteer, or did we carve Barb into this other kind of volunteer category? Give everybody the opportunity to help you comply with that 2-adult rule. Children deserve it, all right? And I think that standard of care calls for it, even if AB506 does not. All right, let's talk about some other challenges presented related to the policies and procedures. Okay, I've had a number of organizations call me and say, what about our programming that involves confessions and other types of private communications? You know, some of my Jewish organizations saying, as we prepare young boys or young girls for their bar mitzvah or bar mitzvah, you know, there's some spiritual discussion, there's some evaluation that's taking place, and by virtue of the age in which that happens, that's 11, 12-year-old, you know, young people, and those are private conversations, and some of that still in California is being done on Zoom, right? Well, that's a youth service organization. It's somebody that's having interaction with children. How do we make the 2-adult rule work in that particular context? And that's a tricky conversation, especially when some of those conversations are meant to be private, related to spiritual development, or even counseling sessions, or mentoring sessions, where we have organizations that will pair up an older adult and a child that's usually in a high-risk situation to maybe a reading friends, or some way in which you put those two together, and we send them out such that that behavior between the two of them is not easily supervised, much less have 2 adults that are mandated reporters. How do you deal with this? Now, this is tricky, but it was tricky way before AB506. Because see, when you have those intimate conversations that are one-on-one, you ramp up risk. Okay, that's what the legislature got to see, and even in its imperfection and trying to recognize we have to add that additional adult. Because if somebody wants to give it a go with a kid, if somebody has ill intent, that's exactly the way they would try to structure a program or an activity or an interaction. Call it spiritual development, call it a confession, call it a counseling session. Now the behavior, the commentary, the conversation cannot be overheard or seen by anyone else. That's the perp's dream job, okay? And so with people that aren't perps, that just simply want to engage in those very important types of communication, how do you balance privacy and safety? Because AB 506 isn't the first introduction to the fact that we need to balance those. Now, of course, there's some extra kick in our shorts to make sure that we don't ignore it. And so when I have conversations with folks, especially that are coming at this from a standpoint of, well, who does this legislature think they are? These communications that I'm having with these young people, these are critically important. And no, I can't do it on Zoom and record it and let somebody else listen to it later. These are private and sensitive. No, I can't bring somebody else into the room. No, I don't want their parent in the room while I'm having this conversation with them, because oftentimes they're talking about their parents. Now, at some point, I'm not going to argue with you anymore, okay? There's a balance to be struck. But what I really need is an organization to come to me with a situational awareness of knowing that we are in a culture where children have been in harm's way, and our culture is angry about it, okay? The average settlement of a sexual abuse lawsuit right now is $2.5 million. If it goes to trial, the average resolution is $10.3 million per verdict, okay? I mean, per victim. So we just got to understand, our margin for error is 0. So really the question needs to be, hey, I really think these conversations are important, but can you get creative with me to where I can introduce something to be able to have some more child safety element as a part of this conversation? Because this isn't just about protecting the child. This is about protecting you too. Right? So in the confessions, in the spiritual development conversations, that's tricky. And when I've tried to make some suggestions, oftentimes I'm going to get shot down. But I want to kick that back to the organizations that's telling me these are important and challenge you. How do you do this and introduce that extra person, to introduce that extra piece of oversight, that extra piece of confirming that nothing inappropriate is happening, and be prepared to have the courage that if you can't balance that, we possibly need to find another way to do this. Okay, and that sounds very unloving and un-Jesus-like, but I'm here to tell you we're getting some clear instruction from our culture, from standard of care, from the California legislature, and it's really going to challenge these types of interactions between adults and young people. Okay, the counseling sessions and the mentoring program. So yes, AB 506 is going to challenge you here, but I'm here to tell you that challenge existed even before AB 506 existed. All right, so those are some of the other challenges that we're seeing. Now I want to land the plane on this idea that California tells us the insurance carrier is essentially the sheriff in town, okay? Because there's no oversight body. There's no agency that's going to come to your church, camp, school, or nonprofit and tell you, okay, well, I've got my AB 506 clipboard. I'm going to need to check everybody's certificates of completion for their training and their live scans in. Usually the person with the clipboard who's going to be grading your paper is going to be a plaintiff's lawyer if something goes bad. All right, but see, I don't want my organizations to wait to get sued to know that they're doing this well. But the California legislature is essentially inviting the insurance industry to come in and check your math. So it gives us this provision in the bottom of the legislation kind of saying we're not going to be the cop, but we're going to give our wand to the insurance industry. And it says this: before writing liability insurance for a youth service organization in California, an insurer or an insurance carrier may request information from you demonstrating your compliance with AB 506 as a part of their loss control. Actually, it's part of their underwriting. Okay? So in other words, we can condition renewing your insurance coverage based on whether or not you're complying with AB 506. Now, that's important to know that the insurance company can do that. I'm here to tell you the insurance company will do that. But it doesn't happen suddenly, because in the insurance industry, people need to first start modifying what does their renewal application look like? What do those questions need to say? Because they're not easy questions to ask, because it's not an easy legislation to understand. But I know that they're turning that corner because I'm helping them do it and understanding how to ask these questions. So it used to be that you'd check a single box that said, yes, we have child safety efforts in place. Now give us the coverage we've been expecting and just anticipating you to renew every year after year. Now those applications and renewal applications are going to start to change. It's going to start asking you these questions as a condition of your coverage. So California legislature opened that door, but frankly, the California legislature didn't need to open that door. It's a contractual right of an insurance carrier to do this. They didn't need legislation telling them they could. It's already happening. But because of those amounts of the claims I've already identified and the new clear requirements, what you're going to need to do is comply with AB 506, and you're going to see it be necessary to comply with the broader standards of care, like the additional background check, making sure your training is correct, your policies and procedures are going to accomplish those things. So this is the enforcement mechanism, if you will, but it's just coming. Now, in truly wrapping this up, kind of what I see in terms of the questions that I'm answering on a regular basis, not just in California, but standard of care nationwide, the insurance industry is changing. Okay? What we're seeing is these claims and the number of claims is out of control, and the amounts of money it takes to resolve them cannot be easily translated into premiums. So what we're seeing is modified applications to make sure you, as the child serving organization, are doing what you need to do related to standard of care. And if you're not going to be qualified for coverage related to sexual abuse and molestation, or you're not going to have access to the limits you once had access to, or you're not going to be able to get this excess coverage or an umbrella policy. So a lot of your insurability and the numbers of the products available to you, limits and coverages, are going to be conditioned on what you do to protect the children in your care. That is changing. But not only is the application process changing, the actual insurance policies, the actual products are changing. See, it used to be that you just have this broad coverage for sexual misconduct. And sexual misconduct would cover anything bad sexual behavior that would take place other than the behavior of the abuser. Now what you're starting to see, based on the insurance industry getting far more razor sharp understanding of this risk, you're seeing coverage for the sexual misconduct adult to adult, coverage related to registered sex offender programs, coverage related to sexual abuse and molestation employee, coverage related to sexual abuse and molestation volunteer. You're seeing it unbundled, and based upon the answers you provide or the systems you have in place, you'll only have access to combinations of insurance. See, this is getting more complicated. So underwriting is tightening. Insurance products are modifying, which is why more than ever, sexual abuse issues demand careful navigation, not just on the prevention and the compliance with the law side, but your insurance broker, your carrier that you choose, your risk management partners. It's more critical than ever that you choose wisely to have someone navigate that through with you, because a lot of this is not intuitive. A lot of this is not easy to understand if you don't have someone to help explain it to you. So in conclusion, you must prioritize child safety. Sexual abuse is not intuitive. That's why so many organizations rely on Ministry Safe and us to help them navigate that risk and put an effective safety system in place and to comply with legislation and help you understand the modifications based on new law. But I would highly encourage you, make sure that you have good risk management partners on the insurance side as well. So to land the plane on where you can get information, that past information, ministrysafe.com/AB506. Now the CCIA people are going to have a new website, but you can still access them through Ministry Safe if you choose to go to ministrysafe.com/CCIA. And there's also discounted access to the use of Ministry Safe products and resources by using the code MCH2022, which is provided to you by the good folks at CCIA. So with that being said, Travis, Julie, thank you for again the opportunity to partner with you to resource into the West Coast on very important things.